Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story. August road trips through Appalachia often continue long after the sun disappears behind the mountains. Families push another hour toward home, couples search for vacancies after changing plans, and tired travelers leave the interstate when navigation apps promise a shorter route through small towns. Usually, the worst consequence is arriving later than expected. But in August of 2021, a married couple driving through southwestern Virginia stopped at a roadside motel after midnight because they were too exhausted to continue. They slept there for less than 6 hours, paid for their room, and drove away, believing nothing particularly unusual had happened. The problem began the following afternoon, when they tried to find the motel again. According to every available map, business record, and local official they contacted, the place where they had spent the night did not exist. Mark and Susan Dalton were returning to Ohio after visiting their daughter near Charlotte, North Carolina. Both were in their early 60s and had made the drive several times before, although they normally completed the journey during daylight. On August 17th, heavy traffic delayed their departure until late afternoon. A thunderstorm near the Virginia border slowed them further, and shortly before 11:30 that night, they decided to find somewhere to sleep. Their original plan was to stop at a familiar chain hotel near Withville, but every room available through their booking application had already been taken. Rather than continue driving while exhausted, Mark selected a smaller highway through the mountains and began watching for vacancy signs. For nearly 40 minutes, they found nothing. The highway passed through stretches of forest interrupted by occasional houses, closed service stations, and darkened roadside businesses. Cellular reception weakened as they moved farther into the mountains, forcing Susan to rely on an offline map stored on her phone. Shortly after midnight, they passed an old illuminated sign standing beside a gravel entrance. The sign contained only 2 words beneath a faded mountain logo: Cedar Rest. A smaller panel below displayed vacancy in red letters. Behind it stood a long, single-story motel containing perhaps 15 rooms arranged around a cracked parking lot. The building looked old but maintained, and several vehicles were parked outside. For 2 tired travelers, that was enough. Mark pulled into the parking lot at approximately 12:14 a.m., according to the SUV's dashboard records. The motel office occupied the center of the building beneath a small covered entrance. Susan remained inside the vehicle while Mark walked in to ask about a room. He later remembered the office as unusually plain. There was a wooden counter, a wall clock, several postcard racks, and an old brass desk bell. No computer was visible. A man who appeared to be in his late 70s registered Mark using a paper ledger and accepted cash because the motel's card machine was supposedly unavailable. The room cost $48. Mark received a metal key attached to a rectangular plastic tag marked with the number 12. Nothing about the room initially seemed frightening. It contained 2 beds, a small television, faded floral curtains, and an air conditioning unit mounted beneath the window. The bathroom fixtures looked decades old but worked normally. Susan noticed there was no telephone and no printed information describing checkout times or emergency procedures. Neither considered that particularly unusual for an inexpensive, independent motel. They carried only 1 overnight bag inside and left everything else locked in the SUV. Before going to sleep, Susan photographed the room because the wallpaper reminded her of a house her grandparents had owned when she was young. That casual photograph would later become the strongest evidence that the motel had been real. Sometime after 2 in the morning, Susan woke to the sound of footsteps moving slowly along the covered walkway outside. The steps stopped near their window and remained there long enough for her to become uncomfortable. She expected to hear a neighboring door unlock, but nothing followed. After several minutes, the footsteps resumed and continued toward the far end of the building. Susan checked the curtains without opening them and saw only a thin line of parking lot light beneath the fabric. She eventually returned to bed without waking Mark. At the time, she assumed another guest had simply been searching for the correct room. Mark woke shortly before 3:30 after hearing something different. He described a repeated metallic tapping coming from somewhere behind the bathroom wall. The sound occurred 3 times, stopped for nearly a minute, then repeated. He checked the sink and shower for dripping water, but found both dry. The noise disappeared completely after he switched on the bathroom light. Mark returned to bed and slept until shortly after 6. Neither mentioned what they had heard until much later because both experiences seemed too ordinary to justify concern. Old motels made strange noises, and travelers walked past rooms throughout the night. Nothing about those events suggested that they should leave immediately. The morning was quiet. Thick fog covered the surrounding mountains, and only 2 other vehicles remained in the parking lot. Mark walked to the office, intending to return the key, but found the door locked. A small wooden box mounted beside the entrance instructed guests to leave keys inside when departing early. He dropped the key through the slot while Susan loaded their bag into the SUV. Before leaving, she noticed something she later wished she had photographed. Several doors at the far end of the motel had no room numbers at all. Their windows were covered from inside with what looked like brown paper. She assumed those rooms were being renovated. At 6:27 a.m., dashboard data showed their vehicle leaving the parking lot and returning toward the highway. Less than 20 minutes later, they reached a convenience store where cellular service returned. Susan opened the navigation application and discovered something confusing. Their overnight stop did not appear anywhere in the trip history. The route showed their vehicle leaving the highway shortly after midnight before displaying a long gap in location data. Tracking resumed only several miles before the convenience store. Mark blamed poor reception and continued driving. They reached Ohio that afternoon without further problems, and the strange motel might have become nothing more than another forgotten travel stop if Susan had not realized she had left her reading glasses beside the bed. She searched online for Cedar Rest Motel, expecting to find a telephone number. Nothing appeared. Several businesses with similar names existed in neighboring states, but none matched the building where they had stayed. She enlarged the photograph taken inside room 12, hoping to identify a logo or address. The image showed the beds, wallpaper, nightstand, and part of the front window, but nothing identifying the property. Mark then checked his wallet for the receipt. There was none. He remembered paying cash, but could not recall receiving any paperwork beyond signing the registration ledger. What had seemed like an ordinary overnight stop suddenly became surprisingly difficult to prove. The following morning, Mark contacted the convenience store where they had stopped after leaving the motel. An employee familiar with the area had never heard of Cedar Rest. Mark described the faded sign, gravel entrance, and approximate distance from the store. The employee suggested an abandoned motel several miles south that had closed years earlier after suffering extensive storm damage. Satellite photographs showed a long, single-story building beside the highway, and its general shape looked similar enough that Mark became convinced they had found the location. The couple decided to return the following weekend, partly to recover the glasses and partly because Susan wanted to understand why the motel seemed absent from every online directory. They located the property shortly after noon. The resemblance ended as soon as they pulled into the entrance. The building had no roof across nearly half its length. Several exterior walls had collapsed, vegetation covered the parking lot, and plywood sealed what remained of the office. County notices posted near the driveway warned that the structure was unsafe. A neighboring property owner later told them the motel had been abandoned for at least 9 years. Mark initially believed they had simply found the wrong place, but the highway offered few alternatives. For the next 2 hours, they drove every nearby road searching for another motel matching their memories. They found none. Their questions eventually reached the county planning office. Historical business records showed several small motels had operated throughout the region during the 20th century, including one called Cedar Rest Motor Lodge. That discovery initially appeared to solve everything. Then officials examined the address. Cedar Rest had stood approximately 17 miles from where Mark believed they had stayed and had been demolished in 1998 when the highway was widened. Photographs preserved by the county showed a building with the same general layout described by the couple. The old sign even contained a mountain-shaped logo. But the former property was now occupied by a storage facility surrounded by paved commercial lots. There was no motel left to mistake for an operating business. Mark and Susan provided their photograph to a county deputy after the planning office suggested documenting the incident. The deputy treated the matter as a possible unlicensed lodging operation rather than anything mysterious. Investigators reviewed nearby security cameras, traffic records, and available property databases, looking for a business accepting guests without permits. Nothing supported that theory. One highway camera recorded the Daltons' SUV before midnight. Another recorded them shortly before 7 the following morning. The distance between those cameras should normally have required less than 40 minutes of driving. Their vehicle took more than 6 hours to travel between them. Where it remained during those hours could not be determined from the available recordings. The photograph from room 12 was examined only to determine whether metadata contained coordinates. The timestamp matched Susan's account precisely, showing the image had been taken at 12:31 a.m. Unfortunately, GPS information was absent because her phone had no location signal when the photograph was created. Investigators found no indication that the image had been altered. It showed an ordinary motel room containing nothing obviously unusual. The wallpaper pattern was eventually traced to a manufacturer that had stopped producing it during the late 1990s, although thousands of properties could have used the same design. The photograph proved that Susan had photographed a room somewhere. It could not prove where. The couple eventually accepted that they were unlikely to recover Susan's glasses or identify the motel. They never described the experience as paranormal and remained open to the simplest possibility. Exhaustion, darkness, poor navigation, and unfamiliar mountain roads had confused their memories of the location. Yet that explanation left several details unresolved. Both remembered the same name. Both remembered room 12. The vehicle records confirmed they stopped for more than 6 hours. Susan possessed a photograph taken inside a room matching their description. And somewhere between two highway cameras, their SUV had spent an entire night in a place that county officials could not locate. Months later, Susan noticed one final detail while enlarging the photograph on a larger computer screen. Behind the floral curtain was a narrow gap where the fabric had not completely covered the window. Through that gap, a small portion of the parking lot was visible. Directly outside room 12 stood a metal sign mounted to a wooden post. Only part of its lettering could be read, but the final words were unmistakable. They did not advertise parking restrictions or checkout information. They read, "Office closed permanently." Susan remembered walking past that office twice during their stay. Mark remembered speaking with the elderly clerk behind its counter. Neither had noticed the sign. They never returned to search for Cedar Rest again. Their road trips continued, but overnight accommodations were booked before sunset from that summer forward. The photograph remains stored with their travel pictures, surrounded by images from places they can identify on any map. It is the only photograph in the collection without a confirmed location. For Mark and Susan, the unanswered question has never been whether the motel was haunted. It is something much simpler and somehow more unsettling. On an August night in the Appalachian Mountains, they needed somewhere to sleep. They found a motel, rented a room, slept until morning, and drove away safely. Years later, they still cannot determine where they actually spent the night. In this new story, there is a particular kind of silence that settles over small Appalachian towns during the final weeks of summer. By August, the days are still warm, but darkness arrives a little earlier. Porch lights appear before dinner is finished, and the forests surrounding isolated communities seem to grow larger after sunset. Most nights pass without anything worth remembering. But in August of 2019, families living along a quiet valley in Western Virginia began noticing something strange. It always happened between midnight and 3 in the morning. Nobody disappeared, no homes were broken into, and no crime was ever established. Yet before the month ended, several families had stopped sleeping upstairs, children were staying with relatives, and deputies were quietly driving the same roads every night, trying to discover who kept leaving the porch lights on at houses where nobody lived. The valley contained fewer than 40 occupied homes scattered along 7 miles of narrow road between two forested ridges. Many properties had belonged to the same families for generations. Several older houses stood empty after their owners died or moved closer to larger towns, leaving dark windows and overgrown yards between occupied residences. Everyone knew which houses were vacant. That familiarity was important because the first unusual report involved an abandoned farmhouse that had not received electricity in nearly 11 years. Shortly after 1 o'clock on August 4th, a woman living across the valley noticed its front porch light glowing steadily through the trees. She watched it for several minutes before deciding someone must have purchased the property. By morning, the light was gone. 2 days later, her husband walked to the farmhouse expecting to find contractors or signs of recent activity. The grass surrounding the building remained waist-high. A chain still secured the front gate, and fallen branches blocked part of the driveway. Through a broken basement window, he could see that the electrical meter had been removed from the exterior wall years earlier. Nothing suggested anyone had entered the property. He mentioned the light to a neighbor who immediately described seeing something similar at another vacant house farther north during the previous night. That house had been empty since a fire damaged its kitchen 5 years earlier. Its porch light had also appeared shortly after midnight. The neighbors initially treated the incidents as an odd coincidence. Reflections from passing vehicles could create convincing illusions along the valley, especially when humid summer air settled close to the ground. That explanation became harder to accept after a third light appeared. On August 9th, a retired school teacher woke shortly before 2 in the morning and noticed a bright yellow glow outside her bedroom window. An abandoned cottage stood across the road approximately 100 yards from her property. Its porch was illuminated clearly enough that she could see the railing and front steps. She watched from her window for nearly 15 minutes. No vehicle approached, nobody crossed the yard. Then the light switched off instantly. The following morning, she contacted the county sheriff's office. A deputy inspected the cottage and discovered that the electrical service had been disconnected 8 years earlier. The porch fixture still contained an old bulb, but wiring inside the wall had deteriorated badly enough that an electrician later confirmed it could not have operated normally. There were no footprints around the building and no signs of forced entry. The deputy considered the possibility of someone using a battery-powered lamp positioned behind the fixture as a prank, but removing the glass cover revealed years of dirt and insects that appeared completely undisturbed. The incident was documented and initially classified as suspicious activity. During the next week, the report spread along the valley. 5 vacant houses were involved, each separated by significant distance. Residents consistently described only one illuminated porch at a time. The light usually appeared after midnight and remained visible for several minutes before disappearing. Nobody reported seeing lights inside the houses themselves. Nobody saw vehicles parked nearby. More importantly, the sequence seemed to move gradually north. The first report came from the southern end of the valley. Each later sighting occurred at another abandoned property farther along the same road. By August 15th, deputies realized the next vacant house in that direction stood directly beside an occupied home containing a family with 2 young children. Rather than waiting for another report, 2 deputies parked their patrol vehicles away from the road and watched the property overnight. They arrived before 11 and inspected the abandoned house while daylight remained. Every door was secured, every room was empty, and the porch light had no functioning electrical connection. One deputy positioned himself in woodland overlooking the front entrance, while the second remained inside an unmarked vehicle farther down the road. For almost 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, at 1:38 a.m., the deputy in the woods radioed that the porch had become illuminated. The second deputy reached the house in less than a minute. By then, the light had disappeared. Both officers searched the building and surrounding property using flashlights and thermal equipment. They found no person. The doors remained locked, windows remained secured, and vegetation surrounding the porch showed no evidence that anyone had recently walked through it. The officer who witnessed the light was certain it had originated near the porch ceiling rather than from passing headlights. His body camera had been operating throughout the observation, but the house stood near the edge of the recording's visible range. The footage showed a faint increase in brightness for approximately 40 seconds before darkness returned. It could not identify the source. The sheriff's office increased overnight patrols without publicly discussing the pattern. Investigators worried that publicity might encourage copycats and make the original activity impossible to separate from pranks. Meanwhile, residents began changing their routines. Some closed curtains before sunset, others installed motion lights and cameras. Several families began leaving dogs indoors overnight. The atmosphere throughout the valley changed despite nothing openly threatening having occurred. People were not frightened because someone had attacked them. They were frightened because something appeared to be moving slowly from one abandoned house to the next, and nobody knew what would happen when there were no empty houses left. On August 19th, that question became more difficult to ignore. The next property north had been abandoned only temporarily. Its owner, an 80-year-old widower, was recovering from surgery at his daughter's home several counties away. A neighbor watching the property noticed the porch light illuminated at 2:06 a.m. and immediately contacted deputies. Officers arrived while the light was still visible from the road. According to the incident report, it disappeared as the first patrol vehicle entered the driveway. Deputies searched the house and found nothing disturbed. Unlike the earlier properties, this home still had active electricity. Examination of the security system showed something unexpected. The porch light switch inside the locked house had physically moved into the on position. The homeowner insisted he had switched every exterior light off before leaving. Investigators could not prove otherwise. There was no smart home system, timer, or remote control connected to the fixture. Someone inside the house could easily have operated the switch, yet cameras installed at neighboring properties showed no person approaching or leaving during the relevant period. Doors showed no evidence of tampering. Windows remained locked from inside. Nothing was stolen. The incident provided the first clear evidence that the phenomenon might involve actual human interference, but it simultaneously made that possibility harder to understand. 3 nights passed without another light. Residents began hoping the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after midnight on August 23rd, something entirely different happened. A family living near the northern end of the valley woke to their front porch light turning on. Their house was occupied. The father checked the hallway and confirmed everyone was inside. He walked toward the front room, expecting an electrical problem. Before reaching the door, he noticed a shadow moving across the curtains from outside. It passed slowly from one side of the porch to the other and stopped near the front steps. He immediately moved his family into an upstairs bedroom and contacted emergency dispatch. Deputies arrived 7 minutes later. The porch light remained on. Nobody was outside. Fresh mud covered part of the yard after an afternoon storm, yet no footprints approached the porch from the road or surrounding forest. Investigators searched beneath the house, behind nearby sheds, and along the creek bordering the property. Nothing was found. A motion-activated camera mounted above the garage had recorded the entire front yard. At 12:17 a.m., the porch light activated. Approximately 9 seconds later, the camera briefly adjusted its exposure as though something had moved close to the porch. No person appeared anywhere in the recording. The light remained on until the homeowner eventually switched it off after deputies completed their search. That became the final incident reported during August. The sheriff's office continued patrols through September, but no additional porch lights appeared unexpectedly. Investigators examined electrical systems at several affected properties, interviewed residents, reviewed camera recordings, and searched for connections between previous owners. Nothing produced a convincing explanation. The abandoned houses belonged to unrelated families. Their electrical conditions varied significantly. Some had functioning wiring, while others had been disconnected from the grid for years. There was no evidence linking the incidents to trespassers, teenagers, former residents, or anyone living nearby. Years later, several of the abandoned houses were demolished or renovated. New families moved into two properties without reporting anything unusual. The valley returned to the quiet routine it had known before that summer. Children grew older, residents moved away, and many people stopped discussing what happened. Yet, those who lived there during August 2019 still remember the order in which the lights appeared. One house after another, always moving north, always after midnight, always illuminating a porch where nobody should have been standing. The strangest detail was discovered much later when a retired deputy reviewed his notes while preparing old records for storage. He plotted every affected property on a county map and noticed something investigators had overlooked during the original response. The houses were not merely arranged from south to north. Each successive property stood almost exactly the same distance farther along the road. When the final occupied house was added to the sequence, the pattern formed a steady progression through the valley, as though something had been stopping at one porch every few nights before continuing toward the next. There should have been one more stop. Less than a mile beyond the final house stood another abandoned property hidden behind trees at the northern edge of the valley. Investigators had never included it because no unusual activity was reported there. When the retired deputy checked historical property records, he discovered why. The house had been demolished on August 22nd, one day before the porch light appeared at the occupied family's home instead. Nobody has ever established whether that timing meant anything. No official report describes the incidents as paranormal, and everyone involved accepts that an ordinary explanation may still exist. But for the families who spent those quiet August nights watching lights move slowly closer through the mountains, one question remains difficult to forget. If that last abandoned house had still been standing, would the light have stopped there instead? In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine. Arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow two-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In this new story, for more than a century, the mountains of West Virginia have challenged investigators in ways few other places have. Dense forests, abandoned mining roads, isolated valleys, and unpredictable weather have often complicated even the most straightforward investigations. Most missing hikers are eventually found. Most vehicle accidents are reconstructed. Most emergency calls end with reasonable explanations. Yet, every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit within ordinary investigative methods. One such investigation began during the final weekend of September 2018, when a routine welfare check along an old fire tower road slowly transformed into one of the most perplexing unsolved cases ever handled by a rural sheriff's office. The investigation centered on Black Ridge, a heavily wooded mountain overlooking a small community in Pocahontas County. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow gravel road originally built decades earlier to service a now abandoned fire observation tower. Although hikers occasionally visited the summit during daylight hours, local residents rarely traveled the road after sunset because fallen trees, loose rock, and steep drop-offs made nighttime driving especially dangerous. On the evening of September 29th, a volunteer firefighter contacted the sheriff's office after noticing a blue station wagon parked beside the abandoned tower long after the surrounding recreation area had officially closed. The vehicle's headlights were off, yet its parking lights remained illuminated as though someone intended to return within a few minutes. Deputies arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, expecting to locate campers or photographers watching the stars from the summit. Instead, they found the station wagon completely empty. The keys remained in the ignition, the driver's wallet rested inside the center console, and a folded hiking map lay open across the passenger seat. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure, recent collision damage, or forced entry. More unusually, investigators discovered a thermos of coffee that was still warm enough to suggest its owner had left the vehicle only a short time before deputies arrived. The surrounding silence seemed ordinary for a mountain after dark, yet the complete absence of any nearby person immediately raised concerns that the driver might have suffered a medical emergency somewhere along the ridge. Search teams assembled before midnight and began working outward from the abandoned vehicle. Experienced tracking dogs quickly identified a scent leading away from the parking area toward the remains of the old fire tower. Investigators followed the trail across a narrow footpath covered with fallen leaves before reaching the tower's concrete foundation, where the dogs unexpectedly stopped. Handlers attempted several restarts from different directions, but every effort ended at exactly the same location. Beyond the foundation, neither dogs nor searchers located additional evidence indicating where the missing individual had gone. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had softened the soil surrounding the summit, yet investigators found only one continuous set of footprints leading from the vehicle to the tower. No return tracks appeared anywhere nearby. At first daylight, the search expanded dramatically. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding mountains, while volunteer rescue teams divided the forest into carefully measured grid sections. Rangers familiar with the terrain searched abandoned logging trails, rock outcrops, and drainage channels where an injured hiker might have become trapped. Mine safety officials inspected several collapsed entrances located miles away, despite little evidence suggesting the missing person had traveled that far. By the end of the third day, more than 100 volunteers had searched nearly 2,000 acres without locating a single additional clue. The only confirmed evidence remained the station wagon, the footprints ending at the fire tower, and the unanswered question of why no trace continued beyond that point. Investigators soon identified the vehicle's owner as 51-year-old Thomas Granger, an amateur landscape photographer from Elkins who frequently spent weekends documenting remote Appalachian overlooks. Family members described him as meticulous, experienced outdoors, and deeply familiar with the region's mountain roads. Camera equipment recovered from the vehicle contained dozens of photographs taken throughout the afternoon, beginning with rivers, abandoned barns, and autumn forests, before ending with several images of the fire tower shortly before sunset. Nothing in the photographs suggested danger or unusual activity. Analysts carefully reviewed every image, enlarging reflections inside windows, shadows between trees, and distant ridgelines. No unidentified people, vehicles, or wildlife appeared in any frame. Digital evidence offered little additional guidance. Granger's mobile phone last connected to a nearby cellular tower at 8:47 p.m. before losing reception, an expected occurrence given the mountainous terrain. GPS information extracted from his camera confirmed he had remained near the summit throughout the evening. His credit cards showed no activity after purchasing fuel nearly 3 hours earlier, while bank records revealed no unusual financial transactions before his disappearance. Detectives considered the possibility that he had intentionally left the area on foot, but his backpack, flashlight, cold weather jacket, and overnight supplies all remained inside the vehicle. Friends later remarked that Granger never explored unfamiliar trails without carrying at least basic emergency equipment. On the sixth day of the investigation, a forestry employee made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. Less than half a mile from the abandoned fire tower, searchers located Granger's camera lens cap resting beside a moss-covered boulder overlooking a steep valley. The item showed no weather damage despite several days of rain, suggesting it had not been lying there since the initial search began. Detectives immediately returned to the area, expecting to uncover additional evidence. Intensive searches lasting another 48 hours produced nothing else. Forensic testing confirmed the lens cap belonged to Granger's camera, yet investigators could not determine how it reached a location that had already been searched repeatedly by trained personnel. Months later, after active search operations had concluded, detectives completed a final reconstruction of Granger's known movements. Every verified fact supported a simple timeline until the moment he left his vehicle. After that point, the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The footprints clearly demonstrated he walked toward the abandoned fire tower. The tracking dogs independently confirmed the same route. The photographs established that he had remained calm only minutes earlier. Yet no physical evidence explained how an experienced outdoorsman disappeared from an exposed mountain summit without leaving behind additional tracks, discarded equipment, signs of injury, or indications that another person had been present. The case remains officially open today as an unresolved missing person investigation. Every few years, advances in forensic technology prompt investigators to re-examine the physical evidence preserved from the original search, hoping overlooked details might finally connect the missing pieces of the timeline. So far, none have. Among retired deputies and volunteer rescuers who spent long days combing the forests of Black Ridge, the investigation is remembered not because of what they found, but because of what they never did. In a place where rain preserves footprints, experienced search teams rarely miss obvious evidence, and mountain trails usually tell a clear story. One ordinary autumn evening ended with a trail that simply stopped. For those who worked the case, that unfinished path remains one of the most haunting unsolved stories ever to emerge from the mountains of West Virginia. In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected two independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the two timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits. Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across 4 independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. In this new story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the 2 researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light quickly, clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly, entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly, completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange, bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual absolute terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient predatory anomalies. In this new story, there are countless quiet communities scattered throughout the mountains of West Virginia where life rarely changes from one season to the next. Neighbors know one another by name, local deputies recognize nearly every vehicle on the road, and unusual events become the subject of conversation almost immediately. Most incidents are explained within hours. A missing hiker is located. A broken-down vehicle is towed away. A suspicious noise turns out to be wildlife moving through the woods. Yet, every so often, an investigation begins with an ordinary emergency call before quietly evolving into something no one can fully explain. One of the most puzzling cases unfolded during the early autumn of 2020 in a small mountain community where several residents reported seeing the same unfamiliar visitor, despite investigators finding no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The community of Laurel Ridge consisted of fewer than 500 residents living along a narrow valley surrounded by dense hardwood forests. The only paved road entered from the south before ending several miles later at the base of state-owned woodland. Aside from hunters during the fall and hikers throughout the summer, very few strangers had reason to visit the area. Because unfamiliar vehicles were immediately noticed, the sheriff's office initially paid close attention when multiple residents reported seeing an older, dark-colored sedan driving slowly through the neighborhood over 3 consecutive evenings. The vehicle never exceeded the speed limit, never stopped at any residence, and never appeared on traffic cameras positioned at the highway entrance leading into town. The first report came from a retired postal worker shortly after sunset on September 19th. While watering flowers near the end of her driveway, she watched an unfamiliar sedan pass without headlights despite daylight already fading behind the surrounding mountains. She remembered the vehicle because every side window appeared rolled completely down, even though temperatures had already fallen below 50 degrees. The driver never looked toward nearby homes and continued north until disappearing around a sharp bend. Believing someone had simply taken a wrong turn, she mentioned the observation to neighbors the following morning without giving it further thought. The following evening, 2 volunteer firefighters independently reported seeing what they believed was the same sedan while returning from a training exercise. They described the vehicle traveling unusually slowly toward the dead-end section of the valley where no public roads continued beyond a locked forestry gate. Curious, because they had never seen the car before, one firefighter turned around after reaching the station and drove back along the same route less than 4 minutes later. The roadway remained completely empty. No intersecting roads existed beyond the point where the vehicle had last been observed, and the locked forestry gate showed no indication that anyone had opened it. After the third report reached dispatch, deputies reviewed traffic camera recordings covering every highway leading into Laurel Ridge. Investigators expected to identify the sedan entering or leaving the community during one of the reported evenings. Instead, every recording showed only vehicles belonging to local residents whose movements could easily be verified. No dark-colored sedan matching witness descriptions appeared on any available camera during the relevant time periods. Detectives initially suspected inaccurate witness recollections until they realized every report described the same vehicle characteristics, the same direction of travel, and nearly the same time of evening, despite the witnesses having no opportunity to compare their observations beforehand. Determined to identify the vehicle, deputies increased patrols throughout the valley during the following weekend. Shortly before dusk on September 23rd, one patrol unit positioned near the southern entrance observed a sedan matching the witness descriptions traveling north toward town. The deputy immediately pulled onto the roadway and began following at a distance of less than 300 yards. According to the in-car video, the patrol vehicle maintained continuous visual contact while rounding 2 gradual curves before approaching a narrow covered bridge spanning Laurel Creek. The deputy crossed the bridge less than 10 seconds after the sedan disappeared from view. The roadway beyond remained completely empty for nearly a mile in every direction. No driveways, side roads, or hidden trails connected to the highway between the bridge and the point where the deputy stopped searching. Body camera footage confirmed the deputy's immediate reaction after losing sight of the vehicle. He exited the patrol unit expecting to find a disabled car concealed behind the bridge or along the tree line. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had left soft mud bordering both shoulders of the highway. Tire impressions from the patrol vehicle were clearly visible, yet investigators found no additional tracks indicating another vehicle had left the pavement. Search teams examined nearby fields, creek banks, and abandoned logging roads before darkness made further searching unsafe. Nothing suggested that another vehicle had been present. The dashboard recording showed the deputy never reducing speed enough to allow the sedan significant opportunity to escape beyond the next curve. The sheriff requested assistance from the West Virginia State Police, who reconstructed the deputy's route using GPS data, video timestamps, and roadway measurements. Accident reconstruction specialists concluded that under normal driving conditions, the sedan should have remained visible for several additional seconds before reaching the next hill crest. Engineers considered whether changing light conditions, dense vegetation, or optical distortions caused by the covered bridge might briefly conceal another vehicle. Multiple test drives using identical speeds and vehicle positions failed to reproduce the disappearance documented by the patrol camera. Every reconstruction reached the same conclusion. The deputy had entered the bridge while the sedan remained ahead of him. Seconds later, the roadway beyond contained no vehicle at all. While investigators continued reviewing physical evidence, county historians uncovered several archived newspaper articles describing remarkably similar reports from the early 1970s. Residents had then complained about an unfamiliar sedan repeatedly driving through the same valley before apparently disappearing near the covered bridge. At the time, deputies concluded the reports probably involved motorists using little-known forestry roads that have since been permanently closed. Modern mapping, however, confirmed those routes had never connected directly to the highway section where the recent investigation occurred. Although the historical reports provided an unexpected parallel, detectives emphasized that they offered no explanation for the current case and should not be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity. After nearly 4 months of investigation, the sheriff officially closed the file as an unresolved suspicious incident. No missing vehicle matching the descriptions was ever reported anywhere in West Virginia or neighboring states. No criminal offense could be identified, and no evidence suggested that witnesses had deliberately fabricated their statements. Investigators remained convinced that everyone involved had honestly described what they believed they had seen. Even today, retired deputies occasionally mention the Laurel Ridge investigation when discussing the most frustrating cases of their careers. Not because it involved violence or danger, but because it challenged one of the simplest assumptions every investigator relies upon. If several independent witnesses and a patrol officer all watch the same vehicle travel along a road with only one possible direction to go, common sense says it should eventually be found. In Laurel Ridge, it never was. And that unanswered question quietly remains one of the mountain community's enduring mysteries. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, The sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the third night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused, discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, few places attract curiosity like an abandoned house standing alone at the end of an overgrown road. To some, they are forgotten pieces of local history. To photographers, they are reminders of communities that slowly disappeared over time. To police officers and firefighters, they are simply dangerous structures waiting to collapse. Yet every so often, investigators respond to one of these forgotten homes, expecting to deal with trespassers or vandalism, only to discover a situation that refuses to follow ordinary logic. One of the most unsettling cases occurred during the spring of 2019 in a remote section of western Pennsylvania, where an abandoned Victorian farmhouse became the focus of an investigation that lasted nearly 2 months. Long after the property was demolished, those who entered the house agreed on one thing. They wished they had turned around before opening the front door. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1900s and overlooked what had once been a thriving coal community. By 2019, nearly every neighboring home had either collapsed or been removed, leaving the property isolated among acres of second-growth forest. County records showed the house had remained vacant for almost 18 years following the death of its final owner. Electricity, water, and natural gas had all been disconnected, while foreclosure proceedings left ownership tied up in legal disputes that prevented redevelopment. Aside from occasional inspections by county officials, nobody was supposed to enter the building. That changed after local hunters began reporting signs that someone was regularly occupying the upstairs rooms despite no vehicles ever being seen nearby. The reports initially seemed routine. Hunters described curtains moving behind broken windows, footsteps echoing across the second floor shortly before sunrise, and fresh tire tracks appearing on the muddy access road before vanishing several hundred yards from the property. Deputies assumed squatters had found a way inside and scheduled a daytime inspection. The search revealed no evidence of recent occupation. Dust covered every floor, bird nests filled several bedrooms, and rainwater had begun rotting portions of the roof. Kitchen cabinets remained empty, fireplaces contained years of accumulated debris, and no food, clothing, bedding, or personal belongings suggested anyone had spent even a single night inside. Investigators documented the property before leaving, convinced the complaints had been exaggerated. 3 evenings later, County Dispatch received another call, this time from a volunteer firefighter returning home after a training exercise. While passing the abandoned farmhouse, he noticed a faint orange glow coming from an upstairs bedroom overlooking the valley. Believing trespassers might have started a fire inside the deteriorating structure, he immediately contacted emergency services. Engine crews arrived within 12 minutes expecting flames or smoke. Instead, they found the building completely dark. Thermal imaging cameras detected no elevated temperatures anywhere inside the house, and firefighters found no evidence that a fire had recently burned. Yet, the responding lieutenant later confirmed that the upstairs window had clearly appeared illuminated while approaching the property from the road. Concerned that someone might be entering and leaving before responders arrived, detectives requested permission to install motion-activated cameras around the exterior. 4 cameras monitored every accessible entrance, while an additional unit overlooked the staircase leading to the second floor. The surveillance system operated continuously for 21 days. During that time, it captured deer, coyotes, raccoons, wild turkeys, and countless smaller animals moving around the abandoned house. It never recorded a single person approaching the property. Nevertheless, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports from passing motorists describing lights in the upstairs bedroom during the early hours before dawn. Investigators eventually decided to remain inside the farmhouse overnight. Shortly before midnight, 2 detectives, a county fire investigator, and a structural engineer entered the building carrying battery-powered lighting, portable radios, and environmental monitoring equipment. Their objective was simple. If someone entered the property, they intended to observe exactly how access had been gained. The first several hours passed without incident. Wind moved through broken windows, loose floorboards creaked under changing temperatures, and wildlife occasionally rustled outside. Everything matched what the investigators expected from an abandoned structure that had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. At approximately 2:43 a.m., one detective noticed an unusual sound coming from the upper hallway. It was not loud enough to identify immediately, but everyone inside heard it at nearly the same moment. The sound resembled the slow movement of wooden furniture being dragged across an old floor. Believing someone had entered through an unseen opening, the investigators climbed the staircase together and searched every room one by one. Each bedroom remained exactly as documented during previous inspections. Layers of dust remained undisturbed, windows were locked from the inside, and no footprints appeared on the floor beyond those made by the investigators themselves. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun and never repeated during the remainder of the night. The following morning, technicians downloaded every surveillance recording collected during the overnight operation. The exterior cameras showed no activity around the house. The interior camera, aimed directly at the staircase, revealed the investigators ascending together after hearing the unexplained sound. Nothing unusual appeared before or after that moment. Audio analysis, however, detected the same scraping noise recorded simultaneously by 3 separate body cameras carried by investigators on the second floor. Because the sound originated on independent recording devices positioned in different rooms, forensic analysts concluded it had occurred within the building itself rather than through radio interference or equipment malfunction. Even so, no source could be identified. Several weeks later, engineers determined the deteriorating farmhouse posed an immediate safety risk and recommended demolition. Before heavy machinery arrived, investigators completed one final examination, hoping structural removal might reveal concealed rooms, hidden crawl spaces, or evidence of unauthorized occupation overlooked during earlier searches. They found nothing. Once the building had been reduced to its foundation, the county graded the site and removed the remaining debris. From that day forward, no additional reports of lights, footsteps, or unexplained activity were ever received from the location. The investigation officially closed without identifying trespassers, criminal activity, or a mechanical explanation for the repeated witness reports. Detectives involved in the case have consistently avoided describing the farmhouse as haunted, emphasizing that the evidence never supported such a conclusion. What they do acknowledge is far simpler. Independent witnesses repeatedly described the same upstairs room. Firefighters personally observed a light that left no physical trace. Investigators recorded an unexplained sound inside an otherwise empty structure, while every entrance remained under surveillance. None of those observations proved anything extraordinary, but together they created a case that resisted every ordinary explanation. Years later, among those who walked through the abandoned farmhouse, believing they were about to solve a simple trespassing complaint, the memory that remains strongest is not what they discovered inside. It is the lingering realization that they left with fewer answers than they had when they first stepped through the front door. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image, captured during sunset, clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all 3 cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving. Don't stop. Stay on the highway. Reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the three files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach.